On May 21st, 1941, Betty Albright and her 3-year-old son, Eldridge, traveled to her mother's house in rural Woodstock, Maryland. Betty had asked her mother if she would look after her son for the afternoon so Betty could catch up on some much-needed sleep. They arrived at Betty's mother's house at about 1:30, and right away, Betty went upstairs to take a nap. As for Eldridge and his grandmother, they went out in the backyard to play. If you were standing on her back porch looking out, it would be 250 meters of just open grass, and it butted up against this huge forest. And in the middle of her property, there was this 3-meter gap in the trees that if you walked through it, it would bring you down to this creek bed that was seasonal, and there was very rarely any water running through it. From the porch, anyone that was standing in this creek bed, you could clearly see. And so Eldridge was allowed to play in the creek bed, along with his grandmother's 3 dogs. As for his grandmother, she decided she would just sit on the porch and read a book and keep her eye on Eldridge. At about 2 p.m., she heard her grandson yell out for help, and she starts walking across the yard towards Eldridge. When she got about halfway across the yard, she heard Eldridge yell out again, except this time, his voice was coming from way off in the forest, and she began running towards the creek bed. When she gets about 10 meters away from the break in the trees, she hears her grandson yell out for a 3rd time, way off in the forest. As he's yelling, it sounds like someone has stifled him and covered his mouth mid-yell. So she runs through the break in the trees down to the creek bed where she stops, and there's no Eldridge, there's no dogs, there's nothing. And then she looks to her left, and one of her dogs is in the creek bed, maybe 10 meters away. Its hair is raised, it's growling, and it's taking little steps back, like it's been spooked at whatever it's seen, but there was nothing, it was just forest. And so she runs back to the house to wake up Eldridge's mother. The 2 of them come back down to the creek bed, and the grandmother is telling her daughter, look, I think he's been abducted, we gotta call the authorities. And so they do manage to get the dogs, and they call the police. The state police showed up with this huge contingent of searchers, and very quickly, police discover some of Eldridge's footprints about 50 meters down on the left side of the creek bed. The footprints, it looked like he had been walking when inexplicably the prints just stopped, which gave the impression that was where someone must have lifted him up and kidnapped him. But they never found any prints connected to a kidnapper. The next day, this one crew that was 4 miles away, they were walking past a swamp when one of them heard what sounded like a child whimpering. And so immediately they turn and start walking into the swamp, and they get to this clearing and they see there's this rocky overhang kind of forming like a cave. And sure enough, tucked underneath this rock is Eldridge. Reunited him with his mother and his grandmother, and the police, along with the mother and the grandmother, sat down with Eldridge and asked him what happened. But unfortunately, Eldridge appeared to not know this had even happened. Although the police came out and said Eldridge must have just wandered off on his own, basically everybody involved in this case believes someone or something abducted him. Unfortunately, there's no clarification about what happened to the other 2 dogs, although the way it's worded in the story, it does sound like they were never found.